overall question. When you see a career gap in a resume, how do you look at it in context of the overall experience? So, Blair, why don't you kick it off?
Thank you, Karen. Yes, in today's world, it's just to be expected with average CEO turnovers of 3 years and less. These days, we know there are going to be gaps. We expect them. And so what we want to understand is, what were you doing during that period? And tell us, what have you evaluated when you've had the luxury of taking time off to think about what do you want to do in your career? Where do you want to go next? And I also have pivoted a few times in my career, starting in global banking, going on to be a CFO with some Scandinavian companies, and then executive recruiting for the last 10 years. So I'm just here to tell you, it really is a luxury, even though it doesn't seem so at the time, to have that gap, to evaluate where you want to go next.
Thank you. And I was going to ask Matt next, and I hope he is actually there. His camera's off. Oh, there you go, Matt. I got a little nervous. So, Matt, what about you? How do you look at career gaps in the overall context?
Yeah, great question. My tip as it relates to this particular topic, I mean, I think context is so important. And so maybe I'll take a half step back to take a giant step forward. And it's a theme across all the tips that I will share today. Your life, your career, it's the greatest story you'll ever create, the greatest story you'll ever tell. And so be thoughtful in that story and own that narrative. And so I think as you talk about career gaps specifically, some of those gaps are forced unwillingly. Some of those gaps, you raise your hand and you jump in and you go pursue something different for a period. I think whether it's the first or the former, I think it's all about you to empower the discussion and to be able to own and articulate what that gap means for you, but that it is in the context of learning, growth, taking something forward, even if that's a trauma or a layoff or something challenging in your personal life.
So when you're looking at a resume, you have to have an open mind in that early stage, it sounds like, Matt.
Very open-minded. I think it's so much about when in the career was the gap and then the reasons associated around it. I'd say what gives me pause more so than a gap is that if I see short tenure and then a gap followed by periods of, a year or less, that's what gives me more pause than a gap in somebody's career that is well-defined or well-articulated by the individual.
Okay, that's great. So let's go on to the next question. What are career gaps that are understandable and possibly even positive, and what do you see as potential red flags? So Agatha, why don't you start?
Yes, I think it's going to be a little bit of overlap already, because I think, the question positive versus negative should be probably rephrased, because I believe that, if individual wants to take a gap, there is a specific reason to do it. So it's for us to explore that reason. That's one aspect. And even if it's taking a rest, because I want to rejuvenate, right? I want to come fresh to the career gap. It's the specific reason. So I think it's very important to explore the reason, but there is no bad reasons. When we're talking about the red flags, again, I would probably think about, whether this is a serial thing, right? Or somebody in the career and every 2 years is having that gap. And even then, somebody may have a bad luck and going through redundancy, right? On a kind of frequent basis. It's a bad luck. So for us, it's important to understand and sort of defend or explain it in front of potential client. And we always can take a reference check, right, if needed. But in general, I think, I believe everybody absolutely has a full right to take a gap. The reason, to be honest, I mean, there is so much prominence these days puts on mental health, for instance. So we should not probably even investigate the reason, because it's a personal story as well. So that's another aspect to it. I think, that would cover that question.
Okay, great. And Joaquin, what would you add to that?
Well, I agree with what's been said here. I think it's very important to own your gap, so to speak, and to be, it's all contextual. whether it's positive or negative, it's not really the question. As long as you yourself know why you have the gap and are not sneaking around with it. Because what brings red flags to me are gaps that are snuck into the CV and that they hope we won't see, or having a story that doesn't check out when you ask what happened during this year, and we're giving a runaround and not the truth. That's where the red flags come. Because then you start wondering, was this guy in jail for this year or what happened?
So when you say sneak the gaps in, what do you mean exactly?
Sometimes people don't put months in their CV. It says I worked with this from 2006 to 2008, and then next job from 2009 to 2011. And when you look at it some other way, you realize that it was June of the year they switched, and then the next job didn't come until 6 months later or something like that.
Got it. Thank you. So I'm going to go on to the next question, but this one is going to be, again, covering the same kind of different angles of the same kind of questions. So are you likely to eliminate a candidate with an unexplained career gap on their career documents, or do you look at the full career? And so, Agata, I think you've already answered a bunch of that. Is there anything else you would want to add to that?
Yes, I think, first of all, and hopefully, CV is not the only thing we look at when we speak with people. It's a human business, right? We speak with individuals, and every person comes with the story. So I think, yes, make sure that your CV is up to date. But on the other hand, things like motivation, your attitude, your proactiveness, those are definitely the aspects that we would be assessing, that's for sure.
Terrific. And Blair, what would you add?
Say that I'm looking, our searches are so specific that we're looking for the experiences, the skills that are transferable. So if there's a gap, you're going to tell us that story through the conversation at some point. But I will just say we're looking for those specific skills. So I'm much more focused on how you write your CV, your resume, how you write your cover letter, how you tell your story. Back to Matt's point, that story and having it succinct and neutral and positive is very important.
Okay, let's go on to the next section. And I think one of the takeaways from this one is own your gap. So I like that as a thought. So let's get into the questions now for this section. And the first one is, again, you can see that there's a flow to all of these questions. How should career gaps be addressed in career documents, resumes, LinkedIn profiles, cover letters? And so, what do you address and where, any suggestions on that? And Joaquin, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, I'm thinking like, tell it how it is. If you've been on a maternal or paternal leave, put that in there. I was taking care of my kids for a year and a half or whatever. Or if you went traveling, I mean, there are a number of gaps that wouldn't be clearly professional, more like taking care of yourself. And it's okay to write that, I think. If the gap is more of a professional character, like you've been made redundant or you're actually looking for a job and things are not going as well as you hoped. A lot of executives, they start consultancies and they have their own company. And I think that's totally fine. But if you do, say I took interim positions, or I did projects for this, that, and the other, the more open you can be about your what you've actually been up to is great.
So being open is really important. And I think the one thing I'd like to remind the audience, for those who join BlueSteps, we have career services that help you put together career documents, tell your story, and really help you be authentic, transparent, and own it. And so I think that's just a suggestion as well. So let's go on to the next question. How can candidates navigate career gap questions during the interviews? Should you wait to be asked about it, mention it up front? Any suggestions? And Matt, let's start with you.
Yeah, thank you. So my tip on this one, first, I think it's all about the connection. And so before you go into a conversation already obsessing about your gap, and we all do that, I would say if you focus on connecting with the person that is interviewing you, or if it's multiple people, forming that human connection first, I think it becomes much easier as the discussion proceeds or evolves to then talk about gaps or other limitations or challenges that you might be feeling about your career. In either context, and this kind of piggybacks off of what Blair was sharing, I'd say as long as you control the conversation when appropriate, I think that's powerful. Again, it's your story to tell. And once you've established that you have the full attention of the audience that's engaging you, and I hate to cheat a little bit, but I saw a Q&A and somebody had mentioned that they'd been out of the workforce or had been working for 20 years, took a 5-year gap, and is now looking to get back into that. I'd say there are very powerful narrative around that you can share in these discussions that will help you connect with your audience and be more likely to be considered or taken serious as a candidate. So I'd say make sure that you're tuned in and that you're listening, and when appropriate, you own the narrative. But I'd certainly, and this is the counter example to this, I've seen people get on a call, they're self-conscious about something on their resume, and it's the first thing that they blurt out or try to discuss, and you make more emphasis or you shed more light on something that is probably a nothing burger in the context of your overall career, as Blair said. And so pause, take a few breaths, make that connection, then when appropriate, own your narrative, talk about your gap, and watch as they race to hire you because they care about your experiences and not why you chose to take time away from your career.
Right. I think that confidence that you are suggesting that they portray is really important. In other words, don't go into an interview apologetic, go into it confident.
Well said.
Your attitude will shine through and will carry the day. But it also can zap you if you go in already apologizing. And so Blair, what would you add to all of that?
Oh, I just had a great situation example this week, and that was a candidate who had taken some time off from leaving a CEO position and was interviewing for another CEO position, had been doing some consulting work on a governmental level. And so I had obviously introduced the candidate, explained the gap in non-specific terms, but legitimate terms, and had vetted it out thoroughly and confirmed everything with the previous board. And really encouraged the candidate to have a short discussion when she was going through the narrative of her career at the right point in the conversation. And she didn't do it. And it came back that it left that void by not talking about it in some very quick way and very legitimate way of how she's now ready to come back, and that situation is resolved, and now she's ready with full energy to be dedicated to another CEO role. So that was a great example where with 2 sentences, probably she could have filled that void, left no doubt, and instilled the confidence of what she could bring to the next strategic leadership position. So this has to be practiced. This is not easy, especially if you've been laid off, you become redundant, they've sold off your division because you were so successful. All these things, reasons, you've got to practice that story. And sometimes you still have feelings around that exit. And you have to be able to look in the mirror and say that story in a very neutral, calm way that's believable and authentic and very short. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, so I think that gets back to the confidence again, right?